And this leads us quite naturally now to the third presentation on the United States. I'm HILBOURNE Watson, who is a professor of political science at Howard University in Washington, D.C., former chair of that department. He's Barbadian by origin. He has written very much on political economy of Caribbean development and United States foreign policy, the international division of labor, and things in that particular area. And he'll be addressing the theme of the United States and the Caribbean, whose New World Order.
Thank you, Luxley, and good morning. I'm sorry, hope I can do better this way. Yeah, the issue of the New World Order, a term which has gained much currency in recent years, is one which I think has not been put into an adequate historical and theoretical framework. What I want to do then in offering some comments is to try to do that. And to do that, it is necessary for me to examine this issue of the New World Order in the context of US hegemony. What has happened in the evolution of US hegemony after the Second World War, what are the various stages through which that hegemony has passed, where is it today, and why has the New World Order concept why has it become so popular in much of the debate or discussions on international relations today. Now, in speaking about hegemony, I'm referring to a particular process at the international state system level where a ruling class operating through a dominant state system is able to achieve a certain degree of consensus at the global level about the definition of terms, about the nature of the global order, about questions such as peace, security, stability from its vantage point, and to win the support of allies and clients around that definition, and to obtain the respect of adversaries around that particular position. Hegemony in this particular sense, therefore, does not mean absolutism. It is akin to an idea of reciprocity associated with dominance and subordination, in which the subordinate gets certain benefits, but at the same time they know what the limits are in terms of their behavior. And when they act outside the dimensions of the system, they may be punished accordingly. And I think that if we accept that, given the limitations of time and so on, to address this question of hegemony, it becomes very clear that a hegemonic power is not by definition interested in the use of force from day to day to impose its will. It will rather operate on the basis of consensus and acceptance. Because if a hegemon must rely on domination and force every day, it violates the very notion of hegemony, and hegemony therefore does not obtain. Consensus is very important at the global level just as much as it is at the domestic level for ruling class to act like a ruling class effectively and obtain the support of the various classes and strata, both within the power block and those, of course, that are not fully integrated into the power system. Now, with that, I move on to indicate that US hegemony was certainly at its most integral point in the 2 decades or so following the Second World War. And during this particular period of time, it was clear that the US had risen to a position of globalism. And during this stage, there was this general consensus around the range, scope, intensity, and depth of American power in the world. And if we look at the formation of the alliance system, the NATO system, the development of the United Nations system with its various agencies, including the World Bank Group, the GATT, and the New York mechanisms, as well as the rise of US currency to the status of international legal tender, the global reach of US capital through the so-called multinational corporations, and the ability of the US to define this context of world stability and order, as I mentioned before, signified its hegemonic position, both in terms of an ideology and in terms of an actuality. The Soviet Union and the system which it represented provided some limitations, if you will, to US hegemony, but that system was not sufficiently decisive in terms of its power and its scope and the support it was able to muster to neutralize US hegemony, but it was indeed an effective force in the context of imposing certain limitations. And if you don't believe that, you simply have to ask some third world countries that were fighting against colonialism and that were struggling for national liberation about the effectiveness of that. Now, moving from into the middle of the 1960s, thereabout, into the late 1970s, it could be argued that US hegemony began to decline, reflecting the economic resurgence of Japan and Germany in the context of Europe, the European Common Market, the way in which the Allies began to question the exercise of American power in the world. For example, around Vietnam, there was much dissension around the war in Vietnam among the Allies, as well as within the domestic base in the United States. The defeat of the US in Southeast Asia, of its policy in Southeast Asia, the rise of third world internationalism associated with the Arab oil embargo, the successes of the national liberation revolutions in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the rise of the so-called newly industrializing countries. All of these began to indicate certain contradictory tendencies in the hegemonic space, if you will. And also at the level of global capital, the behavior of US capital, the formation of the euro currency markets, the ability of supranational finance capital to operate within the interstices of the global economy and outside of the immediate domain of any single nation state. All of these were contradictory effects of this process in the second phase of hegemony, that is the decline of hegemony. And since the late 1970s, in particular during the 80s, the events associated with the end of the Cold War, the decline of, or the end of the foreign policy of containment in the US, the structural problems in the US economy, budget and trade deficits, as well as the debt problem, and these problems are being aggravated during peacetime, the growing inability of national institutions like the Congress to manage national affairs. Look at the rise of Ross Perot today, getting as much popular support he appears to be getting before the election. Clearly a tendency toward the breakdown of the traditional institutions of power and governance in the United States, a deep-seated crisis in the social system at the domestic level. If you look closely, you will see that that is the case. The decline of national capitalism reflected in the expansion of the globalization of the world economy, the tendency toward the formation of world market blocks, the free trade agreement with Canada, the emergence of one with including the North American region, even the proposal for the Enterprise for the Americas initiative, and the techno-paradigm shift, the fundamental shift both conceptually and practically in the technology, the industry, science, labor, production, marketing, every aspect of capitalism reflects a fundamental shift away from the technologies of the old machine-facture systems that became the highest point of the 19th century industrial revolution. All of these indicate a further weakening of the hegemonic base. And then the end of the Cold War in particular, and the events we are now into the 1990s, suggests another phase, if you will. Because clearly where we are now is the passing of an era associated with the consolidation of the United Nations system and what it was set up for. Indeed, beyond the apogee or the zenith of American power in the world. And thirdly, the disappearance of the Soviet system. Now, all of these were based upon 19th century concepts of the nation state, a very backward-looking tendency, if you will. And the world is now at a critical juncture, a very contradictory and unstable stage, looking to the future, as it were, with the backs toward the future. A very unusual situation in which we need to be looking to the future with our face toward the future, but we're marching forward to it, looking backward to the past. And this is a very dangerous phase for hegemony. Because when a hegemon finds itself in that particular situation, it is no longer concerned with decisive leadership because it cannot lead decisively. All the structural mechanisms of leadership are disintegrating around it, and it becomes extremely dangerous. That's why it invades Panama, That's why it invades Iraq and so on and so forth, and decides that by any means necessary it must protect certain interests which it cannot leave up to allies to define, because the position of the United States in the world since World War II has been there is no other country in the world which can be left to define anything that is important to the United States anywhere in the world. Why? Because US imperialism always defines its national interest in global terms. So whether it's in Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, in the heart of Africa, or a village in Nigeria, it is important to US national security interests. So it cannot trust anyone else to define anything for it. So we come to this stage of a new world order with this system, as it were, disintegrating. But we must bear in mind two important points. There's a debate about the decline of the United States. Right? And I have participated in this debate about decline. My position, of course, unlike a lot of positions, is that there are two things we need to bear in mind when we look at this idea of decline. Is it simply some exogenous secular process of decline which the US is experiencing, or is this something that is informed by concrete historical developments? My argument, of course, is that the decline is not due to nature, it is not due to the will of God, it is not the result of any such subjectivism. It is fundamentally reflected at two levels. First, the position which the United States achieved after the Second World War was the result of certain fortuitous developments. The crisis of the war, the impact on Europe and Japan, their relative economic destruction, and the fact that the US was left relatively unscathed in the world. And therefore it achieved a position of prominence by default, way out of keeping with what was normally possible for it. Now that these countries have come back rowing upon the world scene, the relative decline of the US is a function of the emergence of these others, rather than that the US has fallen regardless, if you follow the point. And the second point, of course, has to do with what seems more secular, and a recent study by the Office of Technology Assessment of the US Congress concludes that the US has lost a percentage share of world production and world trade, while the share of imports has increased. The standard of living of American workers has declined in net terms. Productivity of US industry has declined on the average, and these are important considerations. And Japan has done better with a much stronger yen than the US dollar. Very important considerations for us to take into account. Now, one of the reasons imports have increased as they have in the United States is that foreign direct investment in the United States has increased considerably, and foreign investors tend to import certain activities, components, and so on for production. But it is also the case during this time that US investments abroad have also grown considerably. Now, what the US is doing, what is happening in the United States today is you've got what? A military industrial base ahead of any other military industrial base in the world, or military base, but an economic base incapable of supporting military overreach at the global level. And then with Japan and Europe, what do you have? Economic superpowers without a military capability to protect their global economic interests. And the intensification among the various sections of world capital for supremacy in the world market space. If we want to understand hegemony and the crisis of hegemony, I suggest that we can't do it without what I have just said. Whether you agree with it or not, that's secondary. But you have to go out and do the empirical work to analyze what is actually happening in the world to get a sense of the crisis of hegemony. What does it have to do with the US and the Caribbean? It has quite a bit to do with the United States and the Caribbean, I suggest to you. Now, this New World Order thing reflects, as I said, this techno-paradigm shift. The war against Iraq, or the victory over Iraq, was celebrated, but it was really a celebration of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because neither the declaration of the New World Order nor the celebration of the war victory would have been possible without the crisis in the Soviet Union. And once we understand that, we have a better sense of the proportions of this global shift itself. The techno-paradigm shift which I referred to, the shift in the technological base, the shift in manufacturing, the shift in research and development, the shift in the relationship between the state and capital at the domestic level as well as at the international level. And this lag between accelerated technological innovation and the gains of productivity. There's a significant lag because the rate at which capital is innovating globally is way ahead of the rate of returns on those investments. So the rate of profit has been declining rather than accelerating. Because when capital intensifies production, it produces a much larger mass of commodities, each containing a smaller quantity of value, and therefore if you're going to raise the rate of profit, you've got to sell a lot more within a given period of time than you were selling before. But the contradiction, the Achilles heel of capital, is that as it accelerates production, it requires a smaller labor force to produce those commodities, and it puts more people out of work who then cannot buy these mass of commodities. That's why all the overproduction is all over the place, and when overproduction grows, there is an intensification of competition among the capitalists for space in the world market. And that is exactly what we are seeing today. With the struggle with Japan over automobiles and technologies, this is a clear articulation of that particular problem. Now, the US is forced now to re-examine its global position vis-a-vis Europe and vis-a-vis Japan with respect to what it must do. With respect to the military side of events, it cannot come home again. The isolationists like Pat Buchanan and others who are saying, come home America, deal with your domestic base, he's an idiot. Pure and simple idiocy. It can't happen in world capitalism. For the US to come home, to withdraw militarily and industrially to deal with its domestic problems is sure death by self-strangulation. It just can't happen in world capitalism because world capitalism is global. And the US can't do that. And it would be disastrous for the world. Fundamentally. I mean, there's a lot of disaster now, but it would be much worse if they were to try to do that. Hence the articulation within the Pentagon policy establishment of a one military superpower doctrine, which we've been hearing about, and which I read in the Washington Post a few days ago. The Pentagon has decided not to go after that any longer, and it's not because people who have been criticizing can't do it. The means are not there to support that particular position, even though there is an interest in it. Because within the Pentagon, the conceptual architecture of the Cold War has not really died. They must find enemies. They must find enemies all the time. US cannot be comfortable without some idea of an enemy. And now that the Soviet Union is gone, we are hearing 3 times over that there is still a fundamental threat to American security interests from where? The Third World. They have not abandoned that particular position. Cuba is still a threat. Now, Cuba is not a threat to the United States. We know that, but Cuba is still a threat in Washington's view. So I have selected about 3 or 4 points around the Caribbean, which I'll try to speak about very briefly in the interest of time. One is Cuba, the other is Haiti, the third is Barbados. Why Barbados, I'll tell you. And then, of course, the fourth is this broad issue of growing marginalization of the Caribbean in the global environment, as indicated. Fantastic, 5 minutes, all I need. As indicated by Jorge and Andrew Stervin. On Cuba, as you know, Cuba is really a domestic issue in American foreign policy. Congressmen and presidential candidates don't relate to Cuba as a foreign policy matter, really as a domestic issue. Clinton says he's in support of the Cuban Democracy Bill before the Congress, introduced by this reactionary Democrat from New Jersey by the name of Robert Torricelli, a bill which would destroy Cuba fundamentally without firing one military shot. Bush supports it. The majority in Congress support it, and it is likely to pass. This is an election year. What is happening in Cuba, interestingly, the Communist Party is still in power in Cuba. But based on research I've been doing, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Canadians, the Brazilians, the Spanish, the Mexicans, the Jamaicans, capitalists from all these countries are investing in or want to invest in Cuba. In sugar, in oil exploration, in airline transport routes, in tourism, Name it. They're having major discussions with the Cuban government. Washington is saying, no, we can't allow that. Why? On two levels. If you go and invest in Cuba, Cuba turns around with the Communist Party in power and the Cuban economy starts doing well. That's a very bad sign for the rest of the world. If communism collapsed in Europe, in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and then it can thrive in Cuba next door to us, what are you telling the rest of the third world at this juncture? And the second point is, Washington is saying, we have to preempt this restructuring of the Cuban economy, because if the Europeans get in there and buy up all the resources, by the time we are hoping to get something, there will be nothing left. So since we cannot deal with the communist government of Cuba, we must make sure that you capitalists do not. But now in the period of the intensification of global capitalism, Europe is saying to America, like, look, later for you, right? There's no longer a hegemonic consensus, so we're not listening to you. But it's not clear exactly what's going to come out of that. The other point I said was Haiti, the refugee problem. Now, as you know, Haitians face economic death and oppression in Haiti. Aristide came forward with a social democracy project. US imperialism cannot accept social democracy because the social democracy project of Aristide is based upon participatory democracy. The best US imperialism can tolerate is representative democracy, which means the hegemony of the capitalist class, and to enable the military which dominates the scene in Haiti to remain in a position of power to protect US interests there. And that's why they have to move against Aristide. Their hands were all over the coup, dirty as usual. Haitians find themselves on the sea trying to get some source of livelihood. They cannot accept this nonsense about economic borders. It's never made sense in the Caribbean. We've never treated the world as a place with borders. I mean, our people have had to move. They were dragged out of Africa, out of India, all over the world, and thrown around to reproduce a diaspora, and all of a sudden we are told to expect that their borders are North America or Europe. There are no borders for us. There just can't be any borders. We are nations without borders, pure and simple, right? And that is why if a government comes to power in Barbados that is anti-American, it doesn't mean that Barbadians love the United States. They don't want anybody to mess with that exit visa. Right? Whether it's to shop in Miami or to live in New York, don't mess with the visa. The Haitians are addressing this problem. The other point I mentioned was Barbados. Yes. You might have heard of this travel alert issued by the State Department against Barbados that it is an unsafe place to go. How can you believe that? Now, of course, don't be shocked because the US does not operate on the basis of friendship. It is interest. A friend today can be disposed of quite readily tomorrow when the paradigm of interest change. Now, what has happened in the case of Barbados? You know, there's a major economic crisis in Barbados, quite approaching the proportions as we've seen in other parts of the Caribbean. And the sugar is down, the electronics down, garments basically dead, very little active in the economy, even tourism is down. But it has been the main source of foreign exchange. My understanding, the reports have it that there was either an attempted break-in at the US ambassador's residence in Barbados, or some employee of the embassy was assaulted or something of that nature, and up comes this alert. But the alert came a couple of days after the government of Barbados did not vote with the United States on an issue in the UN involving Cuba. Interesting, huh? Very interesting. So here's a small country, weak country, in dire straits. But it's not Barbados in particular that the US is after. There has been an increase in Caribbean trade with Cuba. And Caribbean countries, as they did in the 1970s during Carter's ideological pluralism episode, are saying we can define our space in the global environment. And they're sending a message to everybody, including who? The Jamaican tourism capitalists who are active in Cuba, that we don't like it. And we will go after the one that has been closest to us to let the rest of you understand that you don't have the space you think you have. What is my conclusion? And I will shut up here, Loxley. Very simple. The New World Order substantively has not really come to the Caribbean as it has been articulated. But in a way it has come, because it brings the old and it brings the new. And with respect to US global power, in the context of the crisis of hegemony, what you have is a weakened global power seeking domination. No longer able to lead by consensus, but seeks to dominate. And when a hegemon moves to that particular point, it is at the most dangerous stage for the world. Thank you very much.